Hello everyone, and welcome to Soft Scary Stories. Here you will hear long, thrilling scary stories which will also help you to fall asleep. I really hope you'll give these stories a chance. Like and subscribe only if you genuinely like our content. Now close your eyes and relax. Let's begin with the first story. The Walking Man. This happened about 9 years ago, so some details might be a bit fuzzy, but I remember the important parts like they happened yesterday. My family had just moved to a small town in Oregon, and we were renting a duplex on the quieter side of the neighborhood. Not much happened there, which is probably why what I'm about to tell you was so unsettling. My older sister Emma was 14 and had been put in charge of walking me home from my friend Tyler's house every evening around 7 p.m. Tyler lived about 4 blocks away, which wasn't far, but my parents were strict about me not walking alone after dark, especially since we were still new to the area and didn't know all the neighbors yet. This particular evening in late September, Emma came to get me as usual. The sun was setting earlier now, and there was that crisp feeling in the air that meant winter wasn't far off. We said goodbye to Tyler and started our walk home, taking the same route we always took along Maple Street. About halfway home, Emma suddenly grabbed my arm and pulled me to a stop. "Don't look back," she whispered, but kept walking. "Just keep walking normal, but someone's been following us." Of course, the first thing I wanted to do was turn around, but Emma's grip on my arm tightened. I said, "Don't look," she hissed. My heart started beating faster, but I tried to keep walking normally like she said. Emma was always the responsible one, the one my parents trusted to keep me safe, so if she was worried, I knew something was really wrong. "Are you sure?" I whispered back. "There's a man about half a block behind us," she said quietly. "He was standing by the mailboxes when we left Tyler's house, and he's been keeping the same distance the whole time. Every time we speed up, he speeds up. When we slow down, he slows down." We kept walking, but I could feel my sister's tension through her grip on my arm. Her hand was actually shaking a little. "What does he look like?" I asked. "Just keep walking," she said. "Gray sweatshirt, dark pants. But here's the weird part. He's not trying to hide that he's following us. He's just walking behind us. Like it's completely normal." That's when I couldn't help myself anymore. I had to see. While pretending to tie my shoe, I glanced back quickly. The man was exactly where Emma said he'd be. But what I saw made my stomach drop. He wasn't looking around or trying to be sneaky. He was staring directly at us with this blank expression on his face. And he was walking in this strange, mechanical way. Not fast, not slow, just perfectly steady steps like he was some kind of robot. But the thing that really freaked me out was his mouth. It was hanging slightly open, like he was breathing through it, and I could see him moving his lips like he was talking to himself. Even from half a block away, there was something off about his whole posture. I quickly looked away and stood back up. "Emma," I said, trying not to let my voice shake. "We need to get home. Now." She must have heard something in my voice, because she picked up the pace without arguing. But as we walked faster, I could hear the footsteps behind us, matching our rhythm exactly. Step for step. "He's still there, isn't he?" Emma asked. I nodded, not trusting my voice. That's when Emma made a decision. "We're going to Mrs. Patterson's house," she said. Mrs. Patterson lived just 1 block away, and had introduced herself to our family when we moved in. If he's just walking the same direction by coincidence, he'll keep going. If he's really following us, we'll know. Emma suddenly turned onto Pine Street, pulling me with her. Mrs. Patterson's house was the 3rd one down, with the big rose bushes in front. We walked quickly to her front door, and Emma pressed the doorbell. While we waited, I couldn't help but look back toward the corner. The man had turned onto Pine Street too. Mrs. Patterson opened the door, looking surprised to see us. "Emma, what's wrong, honey?" "There's a man following us," Emma said quickly. "Can we come in for a minute?" Mrs. Patterson didn't hesitate. She pulled us inside and locked the door behind us, then went to her front window to look out. "I don't see anyone," she said after a moment. Emma and I rushed to the window. The street was empty. "He was right there," I said. "He turned the corner right after we did." Mrs. Patterson called our parents immediately, and my dad was there within 5 minutes. He and Mrs. Patterson walked around the neighborhood looking for anyone matching our description. but they didn't find anyone. You kids did exactly the right thing, Mrs. Patterson said. Trust your instincts. But the story doesn't end there. 3 days later, I was at Tyler's house again, when his mom got a phone call that made her face go white. "Boys, come here," she said after hanging up. That was Mrs. Chen from down the street. She said there's been a man walking back and forth in front of the elementary school for the past hour. Just walking the same stretch of sidewalk over and over. She called the police. My blood went cold. What does he look like? Gray sweatshirt, dark pants. The officer said he's not doing anything illegal, just walking on public property, but it's making people nervous. Tyler and I looked at each other. That was our school. And it matched exactly what Emma and I had seen. Tyler's mom drove me home instead of letting me walk that day. As we passed the school, I saw police cars in the parking lot, but I didn't see the man. That evening at dinner, I told my parents about the school incident. My dad's expression got very serious. "I'm going to call the police and tell them about what happened to you and Emma," he said. "This might be connected." The officer who came to take our report said they'd had several calls about the same man over the past week. Always walking, always in the same clothes, always with that blank stare and the moving lips. But he never approached anyone directly, never did anything overtly threatening. "The problem is, walking on public sidewalks isn't a crime," the officer explained. "But we're keeping an eye on the situation." 2 weeks later, the call stopped. The walking man simply disappeared. We never found out who he was or what he wanted. The police never caught up with him. He just vanished as suddenly as he'd appeared. But I'll never forget the way he moved, that mechanical, relentless pace. The way he matched our steps exactly. And especially that blank stare, like he was looking right through us to something else entirely. Emma and I still talk about it sometimes, even now as adults. We both agree that there was something deeply wrong with that man, something that went beyond just being mentally ill or homeless. It was like he wasn't quite human in the way he moved and stared. The scariest part? We never knew if we were random targets or if he'd been watching us specifically. The fact that he showed up at our school suggests he might have known our routine, which means he'd been observing us longer than just that one evening. To this day, whenever I'm walking anywhere, and I hear footsteps behind me that seem to match my pace, I get that same cold feeling in my stomach. And I always look back. Sometimes the most terrifying encounters are the ones where nothing actually happens, where you're left with questions that never get answered, and the knowledge that somewhere out there, something dangerous was interested in you for reasons you'll never understand. I hope you enjoyed listening to this story. Like and subscribe if you genuinely feel our effort. Now let's move on to the next story. The night shift. This happened about 4 years ago, when I was working nights at a manufacturing plant outside Detroit. I'm a 29-year-old guy, and at the time I was living in this little rental house about 20 minutes from work. Nothing fancy, but it was cheap and gave me the space I needed. The neighborhood was mostly working-class families, pretty quiet during the day since everyone was at their jobs. Working the night shift meant my schedule was completely flipped from everyone else's. I'd get home around 6:30 a.m., eat something, maybe watch TV for an hour, then crash by 8 a.m. I'd sleep until about 4 p.m., have dinner, and head back to work by 10 p.m. It was a weird way to live, but the money was good, and I didn't mind being up all night. The thing about working nights is that you're asleep when most people are awake, and alert when everyone else is sleeping. Your house is empty during normal business hours, when most break-ins happen. I thought that made me safer, not more vulnerable. I was wrong. It started on a Tuesday morning in March. I'd just gotten home from work and was making coffee when I noticed my back door was unlocked. Not wide open, just unlocked. I stood there staring at the deadbolt, trying to remember if I'd forgotten to lock it before leaving for work. I'm usually pretty good about that stuff, but I'd been pulling a lot of overtime, and was exhausted. I checked the other doors and windows, and didn't think much more about it. Probably just me being forgetful. But then it happened again 2 days later. Same thing. Back door unlocked when I got home from work. This time I was sure I'd locked it because I specifically remembered checking it twice before leaving. I started to get paranoid. I mentioned it to my buddy Kevin at work, and he suggested maybe I had a faulty lock. Sometimes those deadbolts don't catch properly, he said. Might look locked but spring back open. That made sense, so I tested it before leaving for work that night. Locked it, unlocked it, locked it again. It seemed fine, but I made a mental note to get it looked at. The next morning, the door was unlocked again. But this time, something else was different. My kitchen looked like someone had made themselves a snack. There was a plate in the sink that I didn't remember using, and the milk was sitting on the counter instead of in the fridge where I always put it. That's when I started to get really worried. I called in sick to work that night and decided to stay awake and see what happened. I closed all the curtains, turned off most of the lights, and sat in my living room with a baseball bat, waiting. Nothing happened. I stayed up until 6 a.m., then finally crashed. When I woke up that afternoon, everything seemed normal. I went back to work the next night, figuring maybe I'd spooked whoever it was. But when I got home Friday morning, I knew immediately that someone had been in my house. The TV was on a different channel than I'd left it. The couch cushions were arranged differently. And there was a coffee mug in the sink, one of my good mugs, not the cheap one I usually used for my morning coffee. But the thing that really freaked me out was in my bedroom. My bed was made. Not well, but definitely made. I never make my bed. Ever. Hadn't since I'd moved into that house 2 years earlier. Whoever was coming into my house wasn't just looking for things to steal. They were making themselves comfortable, living like they belonged there. I called the cops that afternoon. The officer who came out was professional but not particularly concerned. No signs of forced entry, nothing stolen, no real evidence of a crime. He suggested I install a security camera and call back if anything else happened. That weekend I set up a cheap webcam, aimed at my back door, and connected it to an old laptop. I figured if someone was coming in while I was at work, I'd catch them on video. Monday morning after work, I checked the footage. What I saw made my stomach drop. At 2:47 a.m., a man walked up to my back door and tried the handle. When it didn't open, he pulled out what looked like a screwdriver and worked on the lock for about 30 seconds. The door opened, and he went inside. The camera couldn't see inside the house, but he was in there for almost 3 hours. The timestamp showed him leaving at 5:52 a.m., just minutes before I usually got home from work. I called the police immediately. This time they took it seriously. They came out, dusted for fingerprints, and took a copy of the video. The detective, Officer Martinez, told me this wasn't unusual. "We see this more often than people think," she said. "Someone figures out your schedule, knows when you'll be gone for long stretches. They're not looking to steal your TV and run. They want a safe place to hang out, maybe get some food and rest." "But why my house?" I asked. "Probably because you work nights. Your house is empty for 10 hours straight, during the day when most people are at work or school. Low risk of neighbors seeing anything suspicious." She was right. During the day, my street was like a ghost town. Everyone was at their day jobs, kids were at school. Perfect cover for someone who wanted to break in without being noticed. The detective told me they'd increase patrols in my neighborhood, but advised me to upgrade my security. Better locks, cameras, maybe an alarm system. I took her advice and had a security company come out that same day. They installed door and window sensors, motion detectors, and cameras covering all the entrances. The system would alert me via text if anything was triggered while I was at work. For about a week, everything was quiet. Then, on the following Tuesday night, I got a text alert at 2:15 a.m. while I was at work. Motion detector triggered in kitchen. Camera showed back door opening. But this time, when the guy saw the camera, he didn't run. He looked directly into it and waved. Then he held up a piece of paper with something written on it. I couldn't read what it said from the grainy video feed on my phone, but it was clearly a message. He kept the paper up for about 30 seconds, then crumpled it up and left. I called the police from work, but by the time they got there, he was gone. They found the crumpled paper on my kitchen counter. In block letters it said, "New cameras won't stop me. I know your schedule." That's when Officer Martinez told me something that still gives me chills. "This guy's been watching you for a while," she said. "He knows you work nights, knows exactly when you leave and when you get home. This isn't random. He's targeted your house specifically." "Why?" I asked. "Could be a lot of reasons. Maybe he's homeless and your house provides regular shelter. Maybe he's got mental health issues and has fixated on your routine. Or maybe there's something else going on. She paused and looked at me seriously. Have you noticed anything else unusual? Phone calls, mail tampered with, sense that someone's been following you. I hadn't, but now that she'd mentioned it, I started thinking. A few weeks earlier, I'd gotten a wrong number call at 3 a.m. Someone asking for Dave and seeming confused when I said they had the wrong number. At the time I figured it was just a drunk dial, but now I wondered. The detective advised me to vary my schedule if possible, maybe stay at a friend's place for a few nights. Sometimes these situations escalate, she said. Better to be cautious. I ended up staying at my brother's place across town for the rest of that week. When I finally went back to my house the following Monday, I could tell immediately that he'd been back. The alarm system had been disabled, not damaged, just turned off. The guy knew enough about security systems to bypass mine. That's when I found the photos. Sitting on my kitchen table was a manila envelope full of pictures. Pictures of me leaving for work. Pictures of me coming home. Pictures taken through my windows of me watching TV, eating dinner, sleeping. There had to be 30 or 40 photos taken over what looked like several weeks. On the back of one photo, someone had written in the same block letters, "You can't hide from me." I packed a bag that day and moved in with my brother temporarily. Never stayed in that house again. I broke my lease and lost my security deposit, but I didn't care. The thought of this guy watching me, documenting my life, knowing my routine as well as I did, it was too much. The police never caught him. They had fingerprints from the house, but they didn't match anyone in the system. Officer Martinez told me that in cases like this, the person usually moves on to a different target once their original victim becomes too difficult to access. He'll find someone else with a predictable schedule, she said. Someone who won't be as hard to get to. That should have made me feel better, but it didn't. Knowing that some other person was going through what I'd experienced, that this guy was still out there, still watching and waiting, it made me sick. I changed jobs after that. Went back to day shift work, even though the pay was less. I moved to a different part of town, got an apartment in a complex with controlled access and 24-hour security. I installed cameras and alarms that would make a bank jealous. But mostly, I just became more aware of my surroundings. I pay attention to who's around when I'm coming and going. I vary my routine as much as possible. I never stick to the same schedule for more than a few days. The hardest part is the paranoia. Every wrong number call, every person I see more than once in my neighborhood, every small thing that seems out of place. It all makes me wonder if he's found me again. I know the odds are low. It's been 4 years, and I live in a completely different area now. But the thought that someone could study my life so carefully, could predict my movements so accurately, could make themselves at home in my space while I was working to pay for it, that changes how you see the world. To anyone working night shifts or spending long hours away from home, pay attention to the small things. If doors you're sure you locked are unlocked, if things seem moved or used, if you have that feeling that someone's been in your space, trust your instincts. Install cameras, change your locks, and don't dismiss it as forgetfulness. And if you're living alone with a predictable schedule, make an effort to mix things up. Come home at different times occasionally, have friends over, make your house seem occupied even when you're not there. I learned the hard way that being away from home for 10 hours straight makes you a target for people who are patient enough to study your routine. Don't make it easy for them. I hope you enjoyed listening to this story. Like and subscribe if you genuinely feel our effort. Now let's move on to the next story. The Girl Next Door. I was 24 when I finally scraped together enough for the security deposit on my first solo apartment. After years of cramped dorm rooms and sketchy roommates who left dirty dishes festering for weeks, the thought of my own space felt like freedom. The apartment complex in Riverside, California wasn't glamorous. Beige stucco walls, a pool that looked more green than blue, and parking spots so narrow you had to suck in your stomach to squeeze between cars. But it was mine. The day I moved in, October 2018, the desert heat still clung to everything like a blanket. You couldn't kick it off. I was hauling my mattress up the stairs to Unit 2B when I heard someone clear their throat behind me. Need a hand with that? I turned to see a woman about my age standing in the doorway of 2A, directly across the hall. She was petite with shoulder-length auburn hair, wearing scrubs that suggested she worked in healthcare. Her smile was warm but professional, the kind you'd see on a nurse or dental hygienist. "I'm Sarah," she said, stepping forward to grab the other end of the mattress. "Welcome to the building. Fair warning, the walls are paper thin, so you'll probably hear my TV at night." I'm a bit of an insomniac. I thanked her as we maneuvered the mattress through my doorframe. Sarah seemed nice enough, polite, helpful, the kind of neighbor who'd water your plants if you went out of town. After we set the mattress down, she lingered for a moment, glancing around my empty apartment. "If you need anything, spare toilet paper, coffee, whatever, just knock. I work weird hours, but I'm usually around." "Thanks, I appreciate it. I'm Maya, by the way." "Maya," she repeated, like she was testing how it felt in her mouth. "Pretty name. Well, I'll let you get settled." For the first few weeks, Sarah was exactly what you'd want in a neighbor. She was quiet, considerate, and genuinely helpful. When my internet installation got delayed, she let me use her Wi-Fi. When I locked myself out after a late shift at the restaurant where I waited tables, she called a locksmith and waited with me until he arrived. She even brought me homemade soup when I came down with a nasty cold. "I made too much," she'd say, appearing at my door with containers of perfectly seasoned chicken noodle or butternut squash bits. "Can't let it go to waste." It was the kind of thoughtfulness that made me feel guilty for how isolated I'd become since college. Sarah was putting in effort to be a good neighbor, and I found myself looking forward to our brief conversations in the hallway. The first sign that something was off came about a month after I'd moved in. I was getting ready for work one morning when I realized I'd run out of coffee. I remembered Sarah's offer and knocked on her door. "Maya," she said, opening it so quickly it startled me. "What can I do for you?" "Hey, sorry to bother you. I was wondering if you had any coffee I could borrow. I'm completely out and..." "Of course. Come in, come in." Her apartment was the mirror image of mine, but it felt completely different. Where mine was still half unpacked and chaotic, hers was immaculate. Too immaculate. The furniture looked like it had never been sat on. The kitchen counters gleamed without a single smudge or crumb. But what made my skin prickle was the wall facing the hallway. It was covered in photographs. Not family photos or vacation snapshots, surveillance photos. Black and white images of the apartment building, the parking lot, the mailbox, and mixed among them, photos of me. Me carrying groceries. Me leaving for work. Me sitting on my little balcony reading a book. "I do photography as a hobby," Sarah said casually, following my gaze. "I like to document the life of the building. It's fascinating how people move through spaces, don't you think?" My mouth went dry. "Those are pictures of me." "Just a few. You have such interesting expressions when you think no one's watching." She moved to the kitchen and pulled out a bag of coffee, her movements precise and measured. "Sugar? Cream?" "Just the coffee is fine." I wanted to leave, but something in her tone made me afraid to seem rude. "I should get going. Work and all." "Of course. Same shift as always, 11 to 7, right?" I hadn't told her my schedule. I forced a smile and took the coffee. "Thanks again." That night, I couldn't sleep. Every sound in the hallway made me tense, waiting for the soft knock that meant Sarah was outside my door. When I finally drifted off around 3 a.m., I dreamed of camera flashes going off in the dark. The photos were just the beginning. Over the next few weeks I started noticing other things. My mail would arrive already opened, the envelopes carefully resealed with tape. Items in my apartment would be moved, subtle changes that made me question my own memory. A book placed spine out instead of spine in. My coffee mug turned handle left when I always left it handle right. When I mentioned it to my coworker Lenny, she raised an eyebrow. "Maybe you should talk to your landlord. That sounds like someone's coming into your place." But I hadn't seen any signs of forced entry. My locks were intact, my windows secure. And who would move things around just to mess with me? The answer came on a Tuesday evening in November. I'd gotten home from a double shift, exhausted and wanting nothing more than a hot shower in my bed. As I fumbled with my keys, I heard Sarah's door open across the hall. "Long day?" she asked. Yeah, but the tips were good. I pushed my door open and stepped inside, then froze. My apartment smelled wrong. Not bad exactly, but different. Like someone else's perfume or shampoo lingering in the air. Everything okay? Sarah was still standing in her doorway, watching me. Fine. Just tired. I closed the door and leaned against it, heart pounding. Something was very wrong, but I couldn't put my finger on what. I walked through the apartment, checking each room. Nothing was missing. Nothing was obviously disturbed. But the feeling persisted. It wasn't until I went to brush my teeth that I found it. My toothbrush was wet. I stared at it, trying to remember if I'd used it that morning. No, I'd been running late and skipped brushing my teeth, something I'd felt guilty about all day. But here it was, damp with water, sitting exactly where I always left it. My hand shook as I reached for my phone. I scrolled through my contacts, looking for someone to call, but who would believe me? Hi, I think my neighbor used my toothbrush, sounded insane even to me. Instead, I did what any paranoid person would do in 2018. I ordered a security camera online and paid for next day delivery. The camera was small enough to hide behind a picture frame on my bookshelf, angled to capture the front door and most of the living room. I set it up Thursday morning before work, telling myself I was probably overreacting but needing the peace of mind. Thursday evening, I reviewed the footage on my phone. At 2:17 p.m., my door opened. Not forced, not picked, it opened smoothly, like someone had a key. Someone stepped inside. It was a female figure with blonde hair and a cap. Although the face was not clear, from the outline and the way she walked, it seemed like Sarah. She was moving with the confidence of someone who belonged there. She wasn't hurried or sneaky. She moved through my apartment like it was her own home. I watched, horrified, as she sat on my couch, picked up my book, and read for nearly an hour. She went through my kitchen cabinets, not searching for anything specific, just exploring. She held up my coffee mugs one by one, examining them like they were artifacts in a museum. Then she went into my bathroom. The camera couldn't capture what happened in there, but she was inside for 20 minutes. When she emerged, she had something small in her hand that she slipped into her pocket. She took one last look around the living room, adjusted a throw pillow, and left as quietly as she'd entered. I felt sick. I thought about calling the police, but what would I tell them? That my neighbor had a key to my apartment and was playing house while I was at work. How had she even gotten a key? The answer hit me the day I'd locked myself out. Sarah had called the locksmith, waited with me, then paid the bill. She'd been standing right there when he'd made the new key. That weekend, I changed my locks. I didn't tell Sarah. I didn't explain why I was suddenly distant when we passed in the hallway. I just installed new deadbolts and hoped that would be enough. It wasn't. The following Tuesday, I came home to find a note slipped under my door, in neat, careful handwriting. It read, "New locks won't keep me out of your life, Maya. We're more connected now. Some bonds can't be broken." My blood went cold. I ran to my laptop and pulled up the security footage. At 3:42 p.m., Sarah had tried my door. When it wouldn't open, she'd stood there for a full minute, just staring at the lock. Then she pulled another key, and then inserted it in the keyhole, slowly opening it. As she was about to enter, she stopped and answered a call. She then wrote those lines in the noted, and placed it inside and quietly locked the door. Before leaving, she, however, pressed her ear to my door and stayed there for almost 10 minutes, listening to the silence of my empty apartment like it was her favorite song. I couldn't take it anymore. Friday morning, I marched across the hall and pounded on Sarah's door. "We need to talk," I said when she answered. "Maya, what a lovely surprise. Come in." "No, you come out here." I stood in the hallway, holding up my phone with the video evidence. "I know you've been in my apartment. I have it on camera." Her expression didn't change. If anything, she looked pleased. "Oh good. I was wondering when you'd notice." "Very smart of you. This is crazy, Sarah. You can't just let yourself into my home whenever you want." "Home?" She tilted her head, studying me with the intensity of a scientist examining a specimen. "That's interesting. You think of it as home already." "Of course it is. It's my apartment." "But Maya," she said softly. "No, Maya, it is not." I stared at her. "What are you talking about? I lived here for 3 years before you moved in. Every morning, I'd sit by that window with my coffee, watching the sun come up over the mountains. I knew every sound those walls made, every creak of the floorboard by the kitchen sink. That apartment shaped who I am. My confusion must have shown on my face because she smiled, the expression almost pitying. When my lease was up, the landlord said he was renovating, updating the kitchen, new carpet, fresh paint. She offered me 2A at the same rent. I thought it would be fine, same building, just across the hall. But Maya, you can't just abandon a space that's been part of your soul. So you kept the key. I kept everything. The memories, the routines, the connection to that space. And then you moved in, and I got to see how you lived in my home. It was fascinating. You put your coffee mug in the exact same spot I used to. You sit in the same corner of the couch where I'd watch TV. It's like you were channeling my energy. I backed away from her, but she followed, her voice growing more animated. Don't you see? We're connected by that space. It brought us together. You're living my life, Maya. The least I can do is share it with you. You're insane. Her face fell, and for a moment, she looked genuinely hurt. I'm not insane. I'm just trying to maintain a connection to the life I had to leave behind. Is that so wrong? Yes, it's completely wrong. You can't what? Care about someone. Want to be close to them. Maya, I've watched you for months now. I know you're lonely. I know you eat cereal for dinner when you're too tired to cook. I know you cry during romantic comedies and sing off-key in the shower. I know you better than anyone in your life, and I love you for exactly who you are. The word love hit me like ice water. This wasn't neighborly concern, or even unhealthy obsession. This was something far more dangerous. I'm calling the police, I said, backing toward my door. Are you sure that's what you want? Think about it, Maya. I'm the only person in this city who really cares about you. I bring you soup when you're sick. I help you with your groceries. I listen to you cry through the walls at night, and I want nothing more than to comfort you. Isn't that better than being alone? I fumbled with my keys, hands shaking. Stay away from me, Sarah. I can't do that. We're too connected now. I got inside my apartment and immediately called 911. The police came within the hour. 2 officers who listened politely as I explained about the break-ins, the photos, the note. They were professional but skeptical until I showed them the video footage. That's definitely a legal entry, the older officer said. We'll need to speak with her. They knocked on Sarah's door, and surprisingly, it was open. When they opened 2A with the master key, the apartment was empty. Not just empty of people, empty of everything. No furniture, no photographs, no signs that anyone had ever lived there at all. Only a giant mirror in the middle of the room. Are you sure about the apartment number? The police asked. Then they called the building manager. 2A has been vacant for 6 months. We've been showing it to prospective tenants, but nobody's rented it yet. I stared at the empty space, my mind reeling. That's impossible. Sarah lives here. She's been my neighbor for months. The manager checked his records. Maya Chen, right? You moved into 2B in October? According to my files, you were the first tenant to sign a lease in this building in over a year. We had some water damage last winter, had to gut most of the units and start over. One of the officers was examining the doorframe of 2A. No scratches on the lock, no signs of forced entry. If someone was squatting there, they didn't break in. Check the previous tenant records, I insisted. Sarah said she used to live in my apartment before me. The building manager scrolled through his tablet, then looked up with a frown. There's no Sarah listed in our system for any unit. But, he paused, his face going pale. There was a Sarah Mendez. She died in Unit 2B last winter. Carbon monoxide poisoning from a faulty heater. That's actually why we had to renovate. The whole building needed new HVAC systems after the investigation. The walls seemed to tilt around me. She died in my apartment. Yeah, poor kid. She was a nurse at the local hospital, worked night shifts. Neighbors didn't find her for 3 days. He looked at me with something like sympathy. Look, I know this is weird to hear, but carbon monoxide can cause hallucinations before it kills you. The investigator said she might have been seeing things, talking to people who weren't there. That's probably why she didn't call for help. I sank onto my couch, the same couch where I'd watched Sarah sit and read my book on the security footage. The same couch where, according to the building manager, she died alone, hallucinating in the dark. Miss, one of the officers said gently, when was the last time you had your carbon monoxide detector checked? I looked up at the small white device on my ceiling, the one I'd never paid much attention to. As if on cue, it gave a single, sharp beep. The room went silent except for that sound. Beep, 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 growing more insistent by the second. Jesus, the building manager muttered, already pulling out his phone. Everyone out. Now. As the paramedics loaded me into the ambulance, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the rear window. I looked pale, exhausted. like I hadn't slept properly in months. How long had I been breathing poison? How long had I been slowly dying in the same room where Sarah had taken her last breath? The doctor at the hospital explained that carbon monoxide poisoning can cause vivid hallucinations, memory problems, and paranoia. In severe cases, people report seeing and interacting with people who aren't there, sometimes for weeks or months before seeking help. The good news is you'll make a full recovery, she told me, as they prepared my discharge papers. But you're lucky. A few more weeks and you might have ended up like that previous tenant. I never went back to apartment 2B. The building management covered my moving expenses and broke my lease without penalty, probably to avoid a lawsuit. I found a new place across town, in a complex with working smoke detectors and a landlord who actually maintained the building. But sometimes, in my new apartment, I catch myself looking toward the empty chair across from my couch, expecting to see someone sitting there. Sometimes I make too much soup and think about knocking on a neighbor's door to share it. And sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I wonder if Sarah felt the same way in those final days, confused, isolated, talking to shadows that seemed more real than the world around her. The carbon monoxide didn't just nearly kill me. It gave me a glimpse into the loneliness that Sarah must have felt, the desperate need for connection that made her reach out to anyone who would listen, even if they weren't really there. I learned that the most dangerous neighbors aren't always the ones who watch you through windows or leave threatening notes. Sometimes they're the ones who live in your head, created by your own mind's attempt to survive in a world that's slowly poisoning you. And sometimes the scariest truth isn't that someone is watching you, it's that no one is watching at all. I hope you enjoyed listening to this story. Like and subscribe if you genuinely feel our effort. Now let's move on to the next story. The Mirror House. The silence of the Las Vegas suburbs was a thick, syrupy thing, clinging to the stucco houses and manicured lawns, long after the neon glow of the strip had faded from the night sky. For Diana, the silence was a constant companion, a heavy blanket she'd pulled over herself since the accident. It had been 6 months since she'd lost Mark, 6 months since the screech of tires and the shattering of glass had become the soundtrack to her life, playing on a loop in the quiet moments. At 38, she was a widow, a casino dealer with hands that knew the smooth slide of cards but had forgotten the warmth of her husband's touch. Their house, once a testament to shared dreams, now felt like a museum of a life that was no longer hers. Every photograph, every piece of furniture, whispered his name. To combat the stillness, she'd taken to small projects, pouring her grief into the mundane tasks of home ownership. Her latest endeavor was the fence, a whitewashed picket that enclosed a small, neat garden. She'd spent a weekend stripping the old paint, the sun beating down on her back, the rhythmic scrape of the sander a welcome distraction. She chose a soft, unassuming gray, the color of a dove's wing, and spent 2 days applying it with meticulous care. Standing back, wiping a smear of paint from her cheek, she felt a flicker of satisfaction. It was a small change, but it was hers. The next morning, as she sipped her coffee and stared out the kitchen window, a strange sense of déjà vu washed over her. Across the street, the Hendersons were in their front yard, brushes in hand, dipping them into a can of paint that was, unmistakably, dove gray. Mr. Henderson, a man with a perpetually pleasant, if vacant smile, was applying the first coat to their own picket fence. Diana watched, a frown creasing her brow. It was a coincidence, of course, a bizarre one, but a coincidence nonetheless. Gray was a popular color. The Hendersons, a couple in their 40s with twin girls who looked to be about 8, had moved in a few months before the accident. They were quiet, keeping to themselves, their lives as neat and orderly as their perfectly trimmed hedges. Diana had exchanged pleasantries with them, the usual neighborly nods and waves, but nothing more. She finished her coffee, shook her head, and dismissed the thought. A week later, a burst of inspiration sent her to the local nursery. She spent the afternoon digging in the dirt, planting a border of vibrant, fiery red petunias along the front walkway. The cheerful blooms were a stark contrast to the somber gray of the fence, a small act of defiance against the gloom that had taken root in her heart. The next day, the Hendersons' front walk was lined with identical red petunias, their petals catching the morning sun in the exact same way. The coincidence was now a prickle of unease. Diana stood at her window, her arms crossed, studying the house across the street. It was a mirror image of her own, a common design in this particular subdivision, but now, with the matching fence and flowers, the resemblance was uncanny. She felt a chill, despite the desert heat. The mirroring, once a subtle echo, began to grow in volume. Diana, in an attempt to reclaim some sense of self, decided to change her hair. She'd worn it long, a cascade of dark brown waves, for as long as she could remember. Mark had loved her hair. She went to a salon on a whim and had it cut into a chic shoulder-length bob. The snip of the scissors felt like a severance, a release. She walked out of the salon feeling lighter, a different woman. 2 days later, Mrs. Henderson emerged from her house, her own long hair shorn into the exact same style. The sight of it sent a jolt through Diana. This was no longer a coincidence. This was mimicry. The unease began to curdle into something darker, a creeping suspicion that gnawed at the edges of her sanity. She started to watch them, her gaze drawn to the house across the street with a morbid fascination. She felt like a specimen under a microscope, her every move observed, catalogued, and replicated. She bought a new welcome mat, a cheerful straw mat with a painted-on pineapple. The next day, an identical one appeared on the Hendersons' doorstep. She hummed hollow music. The following afternoon, the same melody drifted across the street from the Hendersons' porch. The suburbs, once a haven of quiet anonymity, now felt like a stage, and the Hendersons were her understudies, waiting in the wings to take her place. She began to feel a strange, suffocating pressure, as if her own identity was being diluted, absorbed by the family across the street. She started to test them, to set little traps. She bought a gaudy pink flamingo and placed it in the middle of her lawn, a garish beacon in the sea of manicured green. The next morning, a matching flamingo stood sentinel on the Hendersons' lawn. She left her porch light on all night, a silent beacon. The Hendersons' light stayed on too. She was living in an echo chamber, her life played back to her with a terrifying silent precision. The paranoia began to seep into her work. At the casino, the clatter of chips and the endless shuffle of cards were a welcome distraction, but even there, she couldn't escape the feeling of being watched. She found herself scanning the faces in the crowd, half expecting to see the Hendersons, their placid smiles and watchful eyes following her every move. She started making mistakes, her hands fumbling the cards, her mind drifting back to the quiet street and the house that mirrored her own. Her boss had taken her aside, his voice laced with a gentle concern that only made her feel more isolated. The true turning point, the moment when suspicion tipped over into genuine fear, came one Saturday afternoon. Diana was in her front yard, weeding the petunias, when the Hendersons twins, dressed in identical pink dresses, skipped across the street. They stopped at her fence, their small hands gripping the gray pickets. "Hello," one of them said, her voice a high, clear bell. "Hello," Diana replied, forcing a smile. "You have pretty flowers," the other one said. "Thank you." They stood there for a moment, their blue eyes so like their mother's, fixed on her. Then, the first one spoke again, her voice soft, almost a whisper. "Mom?" The word hung in the air, a fragile, terrifying thing. Diana's blood ran cold. She stared at the little girl, her heart hammering against her ribs. "I'm not your mom," she stammered, her voice barely audible. The girl's face crumpled, her lip trembling. "But you look like her," she said, a tear tracing a path through the dust on her cheek. The other twin took her sister's hand. "Come on," she said, her voice a little older, a little wiser. "Let's go home." They turned and ran back across the street, their pink dresses a blur against the green of the lawn. Diana stood frozen, the trowel falling from her hand. The world seemed to tilt on its axis, the familiar lines of her neighborhood blurring, distorting. The sun beat down on her, but she was cold, a deep, bone-deep chill that had nothing to do with the weather. The incident with the children was a crack in the carefully constructed dam of her sanity, and the water was starting to pour through. The mirroring was no longer just about fences and flowers, it was about her life, her identity, her very being. They were stealing it from her, piece by piece. The clothes were the next escalation. She bought a new dress, a simple, elegant navy blue sheath for a work event. The next day she saw Mrs. Henderson at the grocery store, wearing the same dress. The sight of it made Diana feel dizzy, nauseous. She abandoned her cart in the middle of the aisle and fled, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She became a prisoner in her own home, the drawn blinds a flimsy shield against the watchful eyes across the street. She stopped going out, except for work. She ate canned soup, the effort of cooking, of choosing, of having a preference, too much to bear. What was the point? when her every choice would be mirrored, her every action copied. She was losing herself, fading into the background of her own life. The breaking point came on a Tuesday. She'd called in sick to work. The thought of facing the world, of putting on a brave face, an insurmountable task. She spent the day in a daze, wandering from room to room, the silence of the house pressing in on her. As dusk fell, she found herself at the window, peering through a crack in the blinds. The lights were on in the Hendersons' house, casting a warm, inviting glow. She could see them inside, a perfect family tableau. Mr. and Mrs. Henderson were in the kitchen, their movements synchronized as they prepared dinner. The twins were in the living room, playing a board game on the floor. A wave of something hot and bitter washed over Diana. It was a parody of her own life, a twisted reflection of what she had lost. She and Mark used to cook dinner together, their bodies moving in a familiar dance in the small kitchen. They used to play board games, their laughter filling the house. The Hendersons had stolen her life, and they were living it, right there, across the street for her to see. A sudden, desperate resolve hardened within her. She had to know. She had to confront them, to demand an explanation for this slow, methodical erasure of her existence. She waited until the house was dark, until the last light had been extinguished. The street was quiet, the only sound the gentle hum of the cicadas. She slipped out of her house, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She crossed the street, her bare feet silent on the warm asphalt. The Hendersons' house was a dark, silent monolith. She crept around to the back, her senses on high alert. A window was slightly ajar. With a surge of adrenaline, she pushed it open and hoisted herself inside. She landed in a small laundry room, the scent of detergent and fabric softener thick in the air. She stood for a moment, her breath held tight in her chest, listening. The house was silent. She moved through the downstairs, her hand trailing along the wall for guidance. The layout was identical to her own, a mirror image. She found herself in the living room, the furniture arranged in the same way as hers. A floor lamp cast a pale, ghostly light, and in the dimness she could see the board game on the floor, the pieces still in place. A chill ran down her spine. It was the same game she and Mark had played on the night of the accident. She continued her exploration, a growing sense of dread coiling in her stomach. The house was eerily clean, sterile, as if it had been staged. There were no personal touches, no family photographs on the mantelpiece, no children's drawings on the refrigerator. It was a house, but it wasn't a home. She went upstairs, her hand gripping the banister. The first door she opened was the master bedroom. It was a replica of her own, the same bedspread, the same curtains, the same book on the nightstand. Her book. She opened the closet. Her clothes hung there, a row of familiar garments. And next to them, identical copies. Panic began to bubble in her chest, hot and suffocating. She backed out of the room and opened the next door. The twins' room. 2 small beds, 2 identical pink dresses laid out for the next day. But there were no toys, no stuffed animals, no signs of life. It was a dollhouse, perfect and lifeless. The last room at the end of the hall was a study. She pushed the door open, her hand trembling. The room was bare, except for a desk and a chair. And on the desk, a stack of magazines. She picked one up. It was a Home and Garden magazine, dated from a year ago. She flipped through the pages, her breath catching in her throat. There it was. A feature on suburban living, a spread on a family in a quiet, idyllic neighborhood. The family in the photograph was the Hendersons, smiling their placid smiles, their twin girls in pink dresses. And the house in the photograph was hers. But it wasn't just the Hendersons. There was another photograph, a smaller one, of a woman with long dark hair, planting red petunias in her garden. It was a picture of her. And another, of a man, his arm around the woman laughing. It was Mark. The magazine slipped from her fingers, fluttering to the floor. A wave of dizziness washed over her, and she stumbled back, her hand flying to her mouth. A sound, a low guttural sob, escaped her lips. And then, the memories came, not in a gentle stream but in a violent, chaotic flood. The car crash, the screech of tires, the crunch of metal, the world turning upside down. The doctor's voice, grave and distant, talking about brain trauma, about cognitive impairment, about the brain's ability to create its own reality as a defense mechanism. The Hendersons weren't real. They were a construct, a figment of her damaged psyche. She had seen the family in the magazine, the perfect happy family, and her broken mind had latched onto them, projecting them onto the empty house across the street. She hadn't been the one being mirrored, she had been the one doing the mirroring. The fence, the flowers, the hair, the clothes, it had all been her, unconsciously copying the life she'd seen in the glossy pages of a magazine, a desperate attempt to rebuild the life she had lost. The pink flamingo, a gaudy, ridiculous thing, had been in the magazine's garden. The wind chime had been hanging on their porch. The navy blue dress had been worn by the woman in the photograph. She sank to the floor, the sobs racking her body, great, gulping sobs of grief and terror and a profound, bottomless loneliness. The silence of the house, of the street, of her life, pressed in on her, no longer a comforting blanket, but a suffocating shroud. She was alone. She had been alone all along. The sound of a key in the front door lock sent a fresh wave of terror through her. She scrambled to her feet, her mind racing. Who could it be? The Hendersons weren't real. The door opened, and a woman stepped inside. She was older, her face etched with worry. She looked around the dark house, her eyes wide with concern. "Diana," she called out, her voice trembling. "Diana, are you here?" It was her sister, her voice a lifeline in the swirling chaos of Diana's mind. She had a key. She had been worried. She had been calling, but Diana hadn't answered. Diana stumbled out of the study, her eyes wild, her face tear-streaked. "They're not real," she whispered, her voice a hoarse, broken thing. They were never real. Her sister rushed to her side, wrapping her in a fierce embrace. "Oh, Diana," she murmured, her own tears falling now. I know. In the warm circle of her sister's arms, Diana finally let go, the carefully constructed fantasy of the mirror house shattering into a million pieces, leaving behind only the stark, cold reality of her grief. The road ahead would be long and difficult, a slow, painful crawl back to a life that made sense. But for the first time in a long time, she was not alone. The silence was still there, but now, there was a voice in the darkness, a hand to hold, a promise of a dawn that would, eventually, break. I hope you enjoyed listening to this story. Like and subscribe if you genuinely feel our effort. Now let's move on to the next story. The Garden. The rain in Portland was a constant, a fine gray mist that settled over the city like a shroud, making the greens of the Pacific Northwest almost painfully vibrant. For Zoe, the perpetual dampness was the price of admission to a city that promised creative freedom. At 24, with a fine arts degree that was proving to be more decorative than practical, she had moved into the cheaper half of a duplex in a quiet, slightly worn-down neighborhood. Her days were spent hunched over canvases that weren't selling, the scent of turpentine mingling with the earthy smell of wet soil that drifted in through her open window. That smell came from next door. Her neighbor, Marcus, a man in his 50s with the weathered skin and calloused hands of a lifelong laborer, was the curator of a garden that defied the city's gloomy disposition. It was a riot of impossible color and life, crammed into the small backyard that mirrored her own barren patch of mud and weeds. Tomatoes, the size of softballs, strained against their vines, their skins a glossy, perfect red. Zucchini and squash sprawled in lush tangles, and rows of lettuce formed crisp emerald green heads. Flowers, too. Deep purple irises, fiery poppies and sunflowers that seemed to track a sun that rarely appeared, grew with an unnatural vigor. The garden seemed to replenish itself overnight. A picked-over beanstalk would be heavy with new pods by morning, a wilting rosebush resurrected with a dozen fresh blooms. Marcus, who she'd learned was an unemployed landscaper, was a quiet but friendly presence. He'd often be out there at odd hours, humming to himself as he worked the soil, his movements slow and methodical. One afternoon, he appeared at her back door, his hands full. "Got more than I can handle," he said, his voice a low rumble. He held out a crate overflowing with vegetables. "Hate to see it go to waste. You'd be doing me a favor." Zoe, whose diet had consisted mainly of ramen and toast for the past week, felt a wave of relief. The produce was flawless, like something from a high-end grocer. Are you sure? This is amazing, Marcus. Thank you. The earth provides, he said with a serene smile, his eyes crinkling at the corners. You enjoy it. That night, she made a simple salad. The lettuce was crisp. The tomatoes burst with a sweetness that was almost shocking. It was the best meal she'd had in months. She went to bed feeling full and grateful, the city's drizzle a soothing lullaby against her window pane. Then came the dream. It wasn't a narrative so much as a rush of sensations. The suffocating weight, the absolute, impenetrable darkness, the smell of damp earth, rich and cloying, filling her nostrils, her mouth. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her as she tried to scream, but her lungs were full of dirt. She could feel the grip between her teeth, the pressure against her eyelids. It was the primal, visceral terror of being buried alive. She woke up gasping, her sheets twisted around her legs, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The fear was so real it left a metallic taste in her mouth. She shook it off as a simple nightmare, a manifestation of the stress of her precarious finances and uncertain future. She continued to accept Marcus's generous offerings. His garden was a miracle of abundance, and her budget was thankful for it. But with every meal she made from his harvest, the dreams returned, each one more vivid and terrifying than the last. The sensation of being trapped underground was always the same, but the details shifted. One night she felt the smooth, cool satin of a coffin lining against her cheek. Another, the rough scrape of a cheap wooden box. Sometimes there was a sense of lingering illness, a phantom ache in her bones. Other times the sudden, jarring shock of an accident, a life cut short. She wasn't just dreaming of being buried, she was experiencing it from different perspectives, feeling the final, fading echoes of other people's terror and regret. The dreams began to bleed into her waking hours. A constant, low-grade anxiety hummed beneath her skin. She felt tired, drained, as if the nightmares were leeching the life from her. Dark circles bloomed beneath her eyes, and her already slender frame grew thinner. Her art suffered. She'd stare at a blank canvas for hours, the vibrant colors on her palette seeming to mock the gray, fearful world she now inhabited. She tried talking to the other tenants in the small duplex complex. An elderly woman named Mrs. Gable, who had lived there for 30 years, was the only one willing to chat for more than a few minutes. Zoe asked about Marcus. Oh, he's a lovely man. Such a green thumb, Mrs. Gable said, her voice thin and reedy. Keeps to himself mostly, but generous with his vegetables. The last people who lived in my place, Zoe began, choosing her words carefully. Did you know them? Mrs. Gable's expression clouded over. A young couple. Nice kids. Artists, like you. Marcus was always giving them food from his garden. They were very grateful. She paused, leaning closer. But they left in a hurry. Barely said goodbye. And the strangest thing, they looked awful toward the end. So pale and thin, with these big, frightened eyes. Like they'd seen a ghost. She tapped the side of her nose. Same thing happened to the fella in 3B. A real health nut, always jogging. Started taking Marcus's vegetables, and within a few months he was gone. Looked like he'd aged 10 years. A cold dread washed over Zoe. Gaunt, terrified. The words echoed her own reflection in the mirror that morning. All of them had eaten from the garden. The connection was undeniable, a terrifying thread linking the vegetables, her dreams, and the fate of the former neighbors. The impossible beauty of the garden suddenly seemed sinister, its vibrant colors a mask for something dark and rotten. She had to know what was buried in that soil. That night she waited, her heart pounding, until Marcus's lights went out. The rain had finally stopped, and a sliver of moon cast a sickly, pale light over the two backyards. Armed with a small hand trowel and a flashlight, she slipped out her back door. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and blooming nightshade. She crept across the wet grass that separated their properties and stepped into the garden. It felt like entering another world. The plants seemed to buzz with a strange energy, their leaves unnaturally dark in the moonlight. She found a patch of freshly turned soil near the back fence, where a new row of kale was beginning to sprout. She knelt and began to dig, her trowel sinking into the unusually rich, loamy earth. It was soft, yielding. A few inches down, her trowel hit something hard. Not a rock. It was a metallic clink, hard in her throat. She dug around the object with her fingers. The soil was cold. She pulled it free and shone her flashlight on it. It was a small, silver locket, tarnished with dirt. She pried it open. Inside, faded and water-damaged, were two miniature portraits, a smiling elderly couple. A wave of nausea and a dizzying flash of memory, a hospital room, the sterile smell of antiseptic, the beep of a heart monitor slowing, then stopping, assaulted her. She dropped the locket as if it had burned her. "It's not what you think." Zoe screamed and scrambled backward, falling into the mud. Marcus was standing right behind her, a silhouette against the lighted window of his kitchen. He wasn't angry or threatening. In the dim light, his face was etched with a profound, weary sadness. "I'm not a murderer," he said softly, stepping into the garden. He bent down and picked up the locket, wiping the dirt from it with his thumb. She died peacefully. At the hospital. Her husband passed a week later. Zoe stared at him, her mind unable to process his words. What does that mean? What is this?" she stammered, gesturing wildly at the garden around them. "It's fertilizer," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "The best in the world. Life comes from death, doesn't it? That's the natural way of things. I'm just helping it along," he explained, his words tumbling out in a torrent of strange, twisted logic. His brother worked at a city morgue. He handled the unclaimed, the forgotten, people who died alone, with no family to mourn them. Instead of letting them be disposed of anonymously, his brother would bring Marcus the cremains, and sometimes, small personal effects that had been overlooked. "I give them a new life," Marcus said, his eyes shining with a fervent, unsettling light as he looked at his beautiful, monstrous garden. "They become part of something beautiful again. They get to feel the sun, the rain. They get to nourish others. It's a continuation, a resurrection." The horror of it settled on Zoe, cold and heavy as a tombstone. The dreams, they weren't dreams, they were echoes, psychic imprints left on the very essence of these people, absorbed from the soil, delivered through the vibrant, perfect vegetables. She had been consuming the last moments of the dead. The terror, the peace, the regret, it was all in the soil. "You need to stop," she whispered, her voice trembling. Marcus looked at her, his expression one of deep disappointment, as if she were a child who couldn't grasp a simple, beautiful truth. "You can't stop life from growing," he said. Zoe fled back to her apartment, locking the door behind her. She packed a single bag in a frantic daze, throwing clothes and art supplies in with shaking hands. She didn't stop until she was in her car, driving away, the duplex shrinking in her rearview mirror. She drove until the sun came up, putting as many miles as she could between herself and that garden. She never went back, but even now, in a new city, a new apartment, she can't eat fresh vegetables without a flicker of fear. And sometimes, on quiet nights when the rain is falling, she can almost smell the rich, dark soil, and she dreams of the beautiful, impossible garden in Portland, where the dead bloom in silent, screaming color. I hope you enjoyed listening to this story. Like and subscribe if you genuinely feel our effort. I hope you enjoyed listening to this story. Like and subscribe if you genuinely feel our effort.